Hey y'all, Austin Kleon here. I am delighted to be talking to my friend David about his book Range. David, how you doing?
Doing very well, thanks.
It's good to see you, man. Thanks for doing this. This is going to be pretty casual. I'm going to ask you about all the things you're one of my favorite thinkers. You're one of my favorite writers working right now, and I feel like we have so many of the same interests, and I think I just can't wait to get started, man.
I
I
appreciate
think the
it.
big thing Mutual Appreciation Society,
Yeah,
I think,
yeah.
is what we have. So the main thing I wanted to ask you about Range is you just put out the paperback, which
Hmm.
I don't have in front of me, but there's a lovely afterword in the paperback. And I'm going to assume that most people watching this have read the book. And if you haven't, you should just read it. But hopefully this will be interesting to you. Anyway, um, I wanted to ask you because I know you have a 2-year-old now. And so the reason I read Range is my friend Ryan Holiday told me that this book was a parenting book in disguise. And I thought that was really enticing because Ryan and I, we both have 2 boys and we're trying to figure out how it's done. So I wanted to ask you because I think Ryan's right. I do think it's sort of like a parenting guide in disguise. I wanted to ask you, how have the ideas either changed or deepened since you became a daddy-o?
So I should say when I turned in the final manuscript of Range, that was I think the day I turned in the final edits was literally the day my wife had her first contractions. And so it was like literally. So that's, talk about racing for a deadline. I'm like, I knew I was going to get busy in a different way soon. But so I was sort of conscious, particularly with one chapter about learning math, that there would be things parents were interested in, and the intro about sports. But it sounds stupid, but I wasn't thinking about it as proactively as a parent until later, which is why I sort of added the
Yeah.
afterword. That's like, okay, let me think explicitly as a parent now. And so I kind of decided to dive a little deeper into sort of two things in the afterword. One of which was something I had only reported on very lightly for the book, and gave me sort of a model for how I think about my own parenting. And another of which was sort of kind of debunking some of the myths of some famous stories of prodigy. So sort of two prongs. So I go off on both of those prongs and just interrupt me if I'm going too far here. But
No.
the first was I spent a little time adding reporting. This is going to sound bad because about a talent management program in the Army, right? That became sort of a model for my parenting. That sounds terrible because it's like the Army became the model for my parenting, but but it's this program called talent-based branching. That, long story short, was meant to sort of the Army was basically hemorrhaging the people it was identifying as future leaders. They were all leaving. And it turns out that a lot of that was because they weren't finding good career match quality, which means your ability to find work that fits well with your interests and abilities that turns out to be really important for your sense of fulfillment and your performance and all these things. And one of the ways they sought to improve match quality was with this programs like one called talent-based branching, where instead of saying, here's your career track, get up or out, they take these future officers and they pair them with a coach-like mentor kind of figure and say, okay, dip your toe into this one career track, reflect on how it fits you with your coach like mentor. You actually have to keep track of those reflections in online portal. Then do another and another. Dip your toe into at least 5 different possibilities. Keep doing these reflections, so-called self-regulatory learning, sort of reflecting on what you're learning. And through that process, a lot of them were surprised by things they turned out to be bad at. Sometimes they thought they would be good at. Also the reverse. They were surprised by things they turned out to be interested in that they thought they would find boring. And 90% of the cadets who went through talent-based branching changed their career preferences. 90%. Just by being afforded this period of kind of bouncing around a little with active reflection while doing it. And that sort of gave me this analogy where I think of myself as the kind of coach-like mentor figure in talent-based branching. My first book was about genetics, and I read enough behavioral genetics to know that parents don't micro-engineer their kids to the extent they think they do, and that you're better off sort of helping them get the maximum amount of learning they can from each thing they try. And I think that's what the Army figured out with those coach like mentors. So, the options you array for your kid are always going to be limited, but I think my role is to get like a nice menu of options and then help him get the maximum amount of signal about himself, about his interests and his abilities and his options and opportunities from each one of those stops. So the next pivot is more informed than the last. So that basically became like a little bit of a model for how I'm thinking about parenting right now. So I put that in the afterword. The kind of second prong was about these stories of prodigies, but that was just a long answer anyway. So
yeah, I mean, that's like that. That's interesting. I mean, I almost kind of want to ask you about my own. I read a great line in a book called A General Theory of Love one time, and they said it's DNA and daily life. I like that a lot more than like nature versus nurture. I felt like it's, they kind of come here with proclivities and things that they're kind of wired for, and then it's just about like what environment they kind of end up in. And so for me, I feel the same way. I used to be a librarian, so I usually joke with people, if I was going to do a parenting book, I'd say parent like a librarian. And the fact that I'm, creating this, I'm creating these spaces in which they can learn who they are, and I'm providing resources. But I like this. I'll be interested to see how I'll have to catch up with you later about how you have them reflect, because I found that, it's almost that thing where if you ask them to be conscious about it, it goes poof.
Yeah. I mean, and I think my son is 2, and so like he's not keeping a journal like an Army cadet or anything like that. So I think
looking at construction vehicles and all the wonderful things that 2-year-olds are into.
He reflects a lot. He's a bit of a celebrity in a local construction scene, in fact. But yeah, so for me right now, it's more about kind of really. There's this thing when I was writing more about sort of perceptual skill development, I came across this term called puppy training, which was like used with divers sometimes, but also it was called puppy training because some like experts who trained dogs for, roles in movies and stuff like that would say, well, the way you train them is by ignoring all the bad stuff they do and reinforcing all the good stuff. And that got adopted by, some coaches and of elite athletes and things like that. And one of the things that's interesting about that is it makes sense. Like if you've trained a dog, actually, right, makes a lot of sense, but it's also incredibly difficult to do, like in our personal relationships, to kind of ignore the bad stuff. Like I think we're much more inclined to be corrective. And so kind of when I see him doing something that seems interesting or new or different, I sort of try to just like ask a question or say something to like reinforce that something good is going on.
Yeah.
And hoping that resonates somehow, or like get him to try. If you like, he was drawing the other day and I'm like, you could draw with 2 hands at once. I read this in Linda Berry's book. I don't know if you follow her account, but she was like, try drawing 2 hands at once. I said, hey, you can try that. It might be easier than you think. And he did it. And then he sort of liked it. So he kept doing it. And so maybe just suggest a possibility, see if he takes it up or not. So that's kind of what I've been sort of trying to do. And I think maybe I'm jumping in too early here with this, but one of the ways that I think a lot of the things I write about relate to a lot of the things you write about is sort of encapsulated in where I wrote and range about Herminia Ibarra's work, who she studies how people make career transitions and find good match quality. And it kind of fundamentally, one of her insights comes down to the fact that there's like this whole big industry that says you should like sit around and introspect and figure out who you are and then like run into the phone booth like Clark Kent and like come out as a different person, where really the research says actually you have to do stuff and then reflect on it and then pivot accordingly. And to me, a lot of what you write about is find a way to do something, like to get, I have this deal like an artist journal before we ever even talked. And it's like a bunch of exercises that are like, here's something that's going to make it easy for you to just do something. And then you can, then you have some information that you can pivot with. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think it's like that's where one of the places that our work kind of resonates a lot.
Yeah. There's a great line in the book where you say, we learn who we are only by living, not before. And I remember years ago, it was Rainn Wilson, actually. He was given this interview and he was saying, well, they were asking him about creative block. He said, well, I think it's really hard to create if you don't know who you are. So he was kind of saying the same thing. You have to like look within and know. And I've always thought the opposite. That was sort of some part of the genesis of Steal Like an Artist, was like, I discovered who I am by doing this work, that it's actually in the making of things that you discover who you are. And there's another beautiful line in the book. The precise person you are now is fleeting, just like all the other people you've been. I think, for me personally, let's face it, this book really, for me, it was just like for me, it was just a huge affirmation of how I just, good job, kid. It's like, good job. But also a warning not to get calcified, not to, but I lost my train of thought there. When I was a kid, I sort of explicitly, the thing I wanted to say is, the older I get, the more, if I can think of myself as a verb instead of a noun, the richer my life is, like Austin, the verb, the Buckminster Fuller, I seem to be a verb, right? Just the ever evolving, shifting. And I will say, with parent, being a parent too, I feel very deeply to think of them as processes, to think of them as verbs almost more than nouns sometimes really helps me. The thing I wanted to ask you about is, like, when I was I'm just kind of like trying to figure out culturally, because when I was a kid, I tried to find the back cover of Shel Silverstein's Where the Sidewalk Ends. My kids have done something with the book jacket, but I remember when I was a kid, I saw him, and he's so striking. He was like this crazy looking guy. But on the back, it said something like, Shel Silverstein writes books and poems and writes songs and has a good time. Or it like listed very briefly, like, these things that he does. And it was a bunch of different things. And I remember thinking, that's what I want to be. I want to be a guy who does a lot of different things. And I remember vividly when I discovered the term Renaissance man, which if you want to be fancy, say polymath, or now we have multi-potentialite, which is just too many syllables for me. But it's like, I act, people say to me, like, well, how did you become this person that was interested in all these things? I was like, I actively modeled myself on these kinds of people. Like, and I knew I was going to take a hit. And I guess this is kind of what I want to ask you about. Could you talk a little bit about, I wonder if this is a false dichotomy even, which is when you have more of a range approach to life, range has to be kind of funded in a way, I guess is the thing. There was a great thing that you wrote about recently about explore versus exploit, which Alison Gopnik's written really beautifully about in her books. This idea that, like, we tend to exploit things in our lives. We're like in exploit mode with our careers and stuff like that. It's like the stuff we know and we do it well and we go at it. And then there's explore mode. And the thing I was thinking a lot about is, like, in my own daily life, the exploring is sort of funded by the exploit mode. So it's like, I'll give a talk about a book I wrote 3, 4, 5, 10 years ago, and that'll pay for my exploration in the afternoon. So the thing I was going to ask you is, like, when everybody wants to have like an a return on investment, right? Like, what's the ROI on how do you, like, if you had to pitch it to people? Because I feel like, and is it a false dichotomy? Is it like a false idea that the more, like, straight ahead specializing is more lucrative than, like, being a generalist? Sorry, that was long and rambling.
No, not at all.
Afternoon.
No, I mean, I think there are areas where it is more lucrative. I think there's no question about it. I think it's always kind of a double-edged sword. And I think that the best example of that is, like, because I'll get these messages from people that I don't think have really read the book, where they're like, they'll be like, have my plumber do my heart surgery? No way, dumbass.
Right. Sure.
Like, that's what I'm saying in this book. But it's interesting to look at surgeons, for example, where being more specialized is more lucrative. But specialized surgeons actually, they have fewer complications, right? The more times you've done a procedure, the fewer complications you have. And in fact, even when you control for the number of times someone has done a procedure, being specialized still has some benefit where they have less complications. Something about their self-identity or who knows what, people that are drawn to them still cause them to have fewer complications. They're also a lot more likely to do the surgery when it shouldn't even be done. And so there's like, people who are less likely to have complications of surgeries that they didn't need. So it's kind of this double-edged sword, right? And I think it's an issue of recognizing both of those edges. So for something that's more kind of broadly applicable, there was, and to speak to the afterword, I added this research that looked in a dozen countries where people were matched for their parents' years of education, their own years of education, their national test scores where those were available. This was randomized, by the way, so 2/3 of the people didn't have tertiary education. So we weren't talking about just like an elite, bubble of privileged people. And some of the people went to more career-focused training, and some of the people had broader education first. And the pattern was the people who had the more career who got into that, because we all specialize to one degree or another at some point or another, like it's a bit semantic. But those who got into a specialty more quickly, they're more likely to be hired right out of training. They're more likely to have higher income right away at their first job. But they ended up sort of so much less. First of all, they didn't have as good match quality, so their growth rates were slower. And they ended up so much less adaptable that when their industry changed, they often ended up going backward or being out of work for a long time or their growth totally stopping. And so the pattern in 11 of those 12 countries was that the people who had that broader base would sort of lose out in the short term and win in the long run. And the faster changing an economy was in a given country, the greater the advantage that accrued to the people who had that broad base. In fact, Germany, which has it's like famous for this like early specialization apprenticeship programs, was the place that had the longest lifetime advantage for the people with the broader base. And I don't think that means we shouldn't have apprentice. I think we should have many, many different ways into various pipelines to accommodate many different life situations. But I think we should be sort of subsidizing some of that explore, because the fact is there's a lot of research that shows that it pays off in general in the long term, whether we're talking about the exploration that is like funding basic research. Like right now, one of the reasons we've been able to have mRNA vaccines so quickly is because many years ago, Katlin Kariko, who was working on something that was thought to just be a curiosity, like why bother with that? It'll never have an application. And then suddenly a pandemic comes along and we have right off the shelf. This is the same thing that happened with HIV and AIDS too. It was somebody was just researching curiosities that were funded. And then suddenly we had all this basic knowledge off the shelf. So I think whether we look at it as a society-wide or sort of from the individual perspective, you want to be sort of thinking about calibrating this exploit is how to build up this broad set of skills that let you figure out where you're best off exploiting, first of all, and so that you sort of gather some knowledge to do it. But then I think we should toggle in and out of that mode. I think one of the things it sounds like you highlighted there was as we become competent at something, I think the natural proclivity is just to keep doing that thing and only that thing, right? Yeah. I talked to economist Russ Roberts. I call this a rut of competence, right? Because you can see this in some skill building literature where like, to use a funny analogy, in like speed typing, he called it a hammock of competence because he said it's so comfy, people don't want to get out. But like, if you look in speed typing, we all do it and get better just by doing it. And then you plateau at like 50 to 80 words a minute. But if you like force yourself to like set a metronome and type faster, no matter how many mistakes you make, and turn it up a little bit, each day for a year, you can get like twice as fast. But just from doing something, we get better, but then we settle into a certain level of competence, at which point you have to start doing different stuff if you want to change. Like, you don't want to go to the weight room and lift the same weights the same number of times every day if you're trying to cause some change and get better. And so I think it's this issue of being sensitive to the fact of when we're just doing the same thing over and over, which is not how you cause the kind of adaptations that kind of make you better.
I think, our book club's called Read Like an Artist. So a lot of the people that read the books are, they have creative aspirations, or they do creative work. And this to me is the big question, because there was Milton Glaser, the designer, has this beautiful video that you can find online. And he says, there is a tension between professional success and personal development. He says, when you are successful with something, everyone will want that from you. That's your style, right? Like that thing. But he said, in order to grow, you have to abandon that thing. He said Picasso, every time he learned something, he threw it away so he could get to the next thing. So I was wondering if maybe you could tell people about your own, there's a meta level of this. Could you talk to people a little bit about what happened after your book, The Sports Gene, came out, and how you found your way to Range? Because there's a really, I think there's a really great story.
And by the way, before, just to do the lead up to that, is my first book. It's called The Sports Gene. I was training to be a scientist in my past life. I was like living in a tent in the Arctic, like studying the carbon cycle.
I didn't know that.
and I would say I was going to be like a very, average scientist. And then I end up getting off that track and going to Sports Illustrated as a temp fact checker. And I was like 5 years behind people I was doing that sort of remedial work for, basically.
Yeah.
And thinking, okay, well, I knew that wasn't the track for me, the science track, so I'm behind, but like now at least I know. But it turned out I started to realize that you take those average science skills, would average around other people like you, and you move them to a sports magazine, it's like you're a Nobel laureate all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Right? It's like you take something that's like totally ordinary in 1 million, move it to another where it's extraordinary. And that's what I sort of kept on doing. So you pay a little bit of really identity cost and sometimes some like salary cost when you do it at first, but then it's like explosive growth. But so in this explore exploit, I think it's affected you. I was writing about this new study that showed that before people have a hot streak at work, they go through a period of sort of broader exploration.
Yes.
And there were a lot of artists in that study, about 26,000 individual scientists, artists, and film directors. And so I talked a little bit about my own experience writing The Sports Gene, which was skill, and was just kind of like my own list of questions as an athlete. I was a college runner, and as a spectator, just questions that I had compiled in my head that I just wanted to investigate. And I had pitched some of them to Sports Illustrated when I was a writer there, and they were usually rejected, saying like, we're not, too many. We have to keep a limit on the number of science articles we have. Because like, if there was ever an article in Sports Illustrated that wasn't just about the NFL, you'd get people writing in saying like, what am I subscribing for? And so when I would write some of these, we'd always get letters saying, I'm not subscribing to the New England Journal of Medicine. I'm like, these people have not read the New England Journal of Medicine. But, and so I thought these were sort of my oddball interests. And then the book, it sort of became a surprise bestseller, basically. It turned out there were other people with these oddball interests. And so it went from being sort of me doing my thing to all of a sudden, I was so unprepared for people to read it that I left Sports Illustrated right when it was coming out to go to the nonprofit ProPublica, which like if you have a sports book coming out,
you leave Sports Illustrated.
Yeah, being introduced as the new guy at ProPublica as opposed to a writer at Sports Illustrated, not ideal. But and so very quickly pressure became to brand myself as like the sports science guy, get started on The Sports Gene 2. I remember going to a lunch, and I had already told my agent at the time, like, this like took a lot out of me. I'm like, so the book involved an incredible amount of travel. Like, I'm not ready to start on another book. Okay. And then it, hits a bestseller list, and we have lunch with the head of the imprint, and I had told him about, and he's like, we're ready right now to sign right now. And I'm like, whoa.
Yeah.
And so I say, we are not ready. And so I have some tough talks with him, and he tells me like, this is your chance. Like, brand yourself as this now or never.
Yeah. You idiot.
Yeah.
You'd be an idiot.
He said I'd be an idiot to not have another book out, like a sequel out in 5 years. Turned out to be 6 years before I had another book out. He's no longer my agent. And it worked out great for me personally and professionally. Even if Range had not been a commercial success, personally, it was a much more fulfilling and interesting project for me to do than to follow up on what I felt like was kind of my capstone project in sports, basically.
I think that was interesting because you said it sort of felt like the end of something, that the Sports Gene felt like the end of something, and everyone wanted you to think that it was the beginning.
Yeah.
But I wanted to, that takes such courage though. It really, and it's weird in this business how, but again, it goes back to the Glazer thing, right? It's like, give us more of that, kid, until everyone gets sick of it. And then I don't know what you do.
But they also assume that you can suddenly do it faster, right? So not only was there pressure to do it again, but to sign a contract that was half the time.
That magic.
of the first one. I'm like, I didn't just magically learn how to do this twice as fast. I saw Ted Chang. I don't know if you read any of his stories, like Exhalation. I read an interview with him where he has 2 story collections that are just amazing.
Yeah.
You know, one of his stories is the basis of the movie Arrival, if people have seen that.
Right.
And his story collections came out in, like, I don't know, 2003 and 2018, something. There's something like 15 years between them. Those dates are probably not exactly right. And so this person interviewing him said, you know, do you ever think, like, maybe you should write a little bit more? And he says, nobody would like it more than me if I could do this faster. But I've learned this about myself. This is what it is.
Yeah. I mean, all the great short story writers. I mean, look at someone like George Saunders, and it takes him, like, I think he said one time it takes him like half a year to write a short story or something.
It's no wonder, like,
it takes what it
bad second albums, you know, because it's like it took them, like, time to find a sound, and then, like, someone rushes them into doing it in a few months or something.
That is exactly what I was about to say. I tend to think of things in terms of music. That's what I studied the most when I was a kid. And so that's sort of, I think it's very easy. Popular music, it's very easy to look at the progression of creative people because it's all based on release dates and albums and stuff like that. I mean, I've been trying to figure out how to ask you a Beatles question since everyone's watching the Beatles documentary. Paul McCartney seems to me someone who was really good at exploring while he was exploiting, basically. Because, you know, I didn't really know this, but the other Beatles sort of, like, bought big Tudor knockoffs in the suburbs, and Paul McCartney kind of stayed in London and was going to, like, happenings and was really into the, like, avant-garde stuff and was sort of a man about town. So a lot of the really raw experimental stuff that people think about, like the tape loops and cut ups and stuff and weirdness in the Beatles, a lot of that came from Paul, actually, which I think is kind of interesting. I was going to ask you about music. There are some really fabulous stories in the music. There's some really good music stuff in the book that I really love. And one of the things that you highlight, so this is like a pet project of mine, which is making a list of people who have differences or disabilities or differences somehow that wind up leading to their signature work. So, like, for example, you talk about how Dave Brubeck was cross-eyed when he was a kid. And that's one of the reasons that he didn't really want to learn straight music, is that he couldn't really read the music. There's another, you talk about Django Reinhardt, which, of course, you know, he had the 2 fingers and stuff like that. And then there's this wonderful part where you're talking about I forget the whole story, but there are, like, a bunch of orphans who are taught music, and, like, Vivaldi composes for them and stuff. And one of the ladies loses she's trained on the violin, but then she switches to oboe, and then her teeth fall out, so she has to switch back to violin. I read this other story recently about I forget her name, but one of the world-class players of the theremin, which is that weird, like, it looks like a little radio antenna that makes the woo, like, sound in Star Trek, the main theme, the woo. She actually was trained I think she was trained as a violinist and got arthritis in her hand. And then she met theremin, and he was like, I've got this new instrument you should try out. So I'm, like, very interested in, have you noticed that in sports? Because one of the studies that I love that I think's in the book, or you've posted about it before, is how much repetitive stress injury there is in sports because of early specialization.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, what is it about, like, flexibility and the ability to adapt when our bodies do weird things, like, you know, particularly in, like, creative fields? Do you have any, like, thoughts about that? Do you keep any of that stuff around? Like, I have a big list of musicians, like Regina Spektor wanted to be a classical pianist, but her hands are really small, so she turned to pop. You know, just stuff like that. That this idea that, like, our limitations are where we kind of, like, rustle out our really good work.
I mean, I think those kinds of like forced adaptations, basically, for lack of a better
Yeah,
term. By
that's
the
a
way,
great way of putting it. Like
the Django
forced
Reinhardt one is
adaptation.
amazing. So I listened to like you can get, I think I collected every recording that like
Yeah.
exists of his, and you can hear the before and after of when he had the injury where he, lost the use of some of his
Yeah.
fingers. And it's just amazing to hear the difference. And you wonder, like, if he hadn't lost the use of some of his fingers in a fire, like, how would the history of guitar
Yeah.
be different?
Right.
And so I think those forced adaptations, it's like, in many cases, no one would do those things unless they had to, but it's great that they do. And I think
Yeah.
that goes from, all of us use these in some way. So I write a little bit about how, like, in the book, briefly about how chess players can, like, expert chess players can remember all the pieces on a board, like, no problem. But if you put them in a situation, so it was thought in early studies that they had photographic memories. And so then people with, were screened for memory tests to see who should be trained for chess and all this stuff. But then it turned out, when these studies were repeated years later, that if you put the pieces in arrangements where they would never quite occur in a game, suddenly these grandmaster chess players, their memory was no better than normal, right? It was that they had
Right.
learned how to group pieces and sort of take meaning quickly that made it easy for them to remember what they were seeing. Just like if I gave you like a 20 random words, you probably wouldn't be able to repeat them back to me. If I give you a 20 word sentence, you'd have a shot because you've learned
Right.
a
There's a
framework, a
context.
system of grammar, right?
Yeah.
And so that is like an adaptation that we all use in sort of memory to overcome basic limitations. So we come up with these sort of ingenious strategies, those ones unconscious, that force us to build like these generalized, flexible models because of our own limitations. Like in my first book, I write about this is how nobody has reflexes fast enough to hit 100-mile-per-hour fastballs. This is the first chapter of the sports gene. In fact, you give your kid, I don't know if your kids play baseball or anything, but if you give them the advice, keep your eye on the ball, it's like, you actually can't track an object as its angular position changes that rapidly as it gets close to your face. So they could close their eyes when the ball were halfway in. It wouldn't make any difference whatsoever. If it weren't like psychologically upsetting, it wouldn't make a difference.
Right. Right.
But we can overcome those with these adaptations where we're forced to like pick information out of the body of the person throwing the ball to let us see what's coming before it gets there. So again, it's like these constraints of our limitations force these kind of ingenious adaptations that let us do pretty incredible things. And I think
Yeah.
that's kind of all over the place in art. I mean, Jackson Pollock is one that I think of where he turned to what he did because he was bad. He was like last in his drawing class,
Yeah.
but had these artistic sensibilities, and
Yeah.
this aesthetic mind, and so was forced to go search for something. The same with Van Gogh, who I write about, which was he was a bad draftsman. For a while, you can see in his letters, he's saying like one should only draw figures, people. That's like, that's like part of like the divine plan and all this stuff. And then he turns out to not be very good at it. He doesn't have like that steady hand. And so in his
Yeah.
later paintings, in all of the paintings that most people recognize of his were done in the last 2 years of his life, when he sort of merged these stylistic experiments, you'll see like he's not even bothering with people's fingers, where he like would spend months on someone's finger in earlier paintings. Now it's just like, oh, it's like a mitten, whatever, forget about it. And so I think in many cases, these limitations, even if we wouldn't put them on ourselves, can drive in sort of incredible creativity. I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I've been interested in haiku for a long time, which obviously is a very limited form. Even more so, if it were more kind of the accurate translation from Japanese would probably be like 12 syllable poems in English, really.
Right. Right.
And haiku was part of a longer poetic form. It was like the introduction to a longer poetic form. And it was really when this one practitioner kind of lopped off the top and turned it into this much more difficult to work with thing that required you, as he would say, to focus in on one image and cup it in your hands and kind of show it to another person, that it became the form, that made it a millennium later, essentially. And so I think these limitations, whether they're forced or arbitrary, can be like really powerful mechanisms for getting us out of that sort of hammock of normal competence, or just, or helping us find kind of different ways to use what we've got.
The haiku thing is really interesting. I mean, that's I wanted to ask you about reading. You mentioned Van Gogh. I was going to ask you about Van Gogh, but you brought him up. So I wanted to ask you about your own reading life. and what it looks like. And I read a really something that really affected me as a young writer is when I realized that writers need to read about 3 to 4 to 5 times more than they write, at least, that the ratio of reading needs to be so much bigger than the writing. And so I was just going to ask you about your input. Like, what do you read on a daily basis? What do you like? How do you find what you're going to read? What do you read? What's your reading life look like on a day-to-day basis? And does it change a lot when you work on a book?
It does change a lot when I work on a book, and it's sort of hard for me to reconstruct. I would say that I became a voracious reader in my late 20s, basically.
Cool.
Because I remember I used to move a lot when I was in my early 20s, and I know I didn't have a lot of stuff, and now like if I move, I have to like fill a million boxes with books.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like I once at a previous job when I was trying to get into journalism wrote an article about libraries at universities, and most libraries were decreasing the amount of physical books they had in their libraries, whereas the University of Chicago was going the opposite direction, increasing it. And I remember one of the people in charge of this said, that's because we think, people to explore intellectually have to be sort of like like an ape swinging from one vine to another, and they may go to a section and find things that they weren't looking for.
I like that image, the Tarzan. I'm going to think about that next time at the library.
But that feels so true to me. Like when I go
absolutely.
to like an indie bookstore, it's like to find an interest I didn't know I had. Like I'll go in looking for one thing and I may go to that section, but it's probably not what I'm going to walk out with. Yeah. So I need that sort of different from just going on Amazon too, where it's fine to have things recommended to me.
Yeah.
I don't kind of find those, I've realized that you need some serendipity. Like I've read
serendipity of the stacks.
Yeah, serendipity of the stacks. I've read research that says people don't like you as much when you say that like some of your success is luck, but it's still true. And so there are a few things that I right now will read kind of every week. So I have London review of books, New York review of books, neither of which are really book reviews. It's kind of they're like essays sometimes informed by books, but it's like sometimes it's reviewing a book that's like 10 years old. So like obviously someone just wanted to write about a topic, right? So those are two amazing things that always lead me down some other track. Every issue of New Scientist I'll look at least weekly, which is a British publication that just sort of looks at what's current research. And then I'll just kind of follow my nose a little bit. And I have a mix. I make sure to read a lot of, even though I write in nonfiction, to read a lot of fiction, because I think there's more structural variety. To me, most of the hard work of writing is structure, organizing information, not like
absolutely
focusing on the sentences, not only organizing information, but reorganizing information. Because once you put something down, there's a very strong anchoring bias to not wholly reorder it, even if you should. Like if you ever I don't know if you get asked like to help any friends with like admissions essays or anything, but if you start with,
friends.
If you start with like you're starting in the wrong place, you need to reorder it. The response is typically for me is like, can you just make some of the sentences better? Like that's not really
I don't want to rethink my life. I just want some line edits. Yeah. Why are you doing this to me?
And so one of the other thing that I just enjoy fiction is I try to read it paying attention to structure, because my books, there's no perfect answer to the questions I'm addressing in my book. Like these are how broad or or specialized to be. It's like it's a topic that's important to everyone at some point or another. Everyone discusses, usually only with their own intuition or personal experience. Can I bring stories and research to it to make those discussions more interesting and productive? And because I'm not going to have a perfect answer, I have to arrange it so that one sort of out point, like if you think about film, the most useful thing I ever did for learning about writing structure was a film editing experience. Where can I share what that is? Because it might be useful for people if there are people on here interested in writing.
Please do. One of the best books about writing, I think, is I will remember the title, In the Blink of an Eye, Walter Murch, the film editor, his book about film editing.
Oh, interesting. All right.
I think that helps. I think the way, read that, because this really is what the whole interview should have been. But so tell us about film editing, because this sets off my meter too.
So I had this experience where a friend of mine had to edit a documentary, and he had repetitive stress injury, too much mousing or whatever. So he asked me, could I be the motor skills while he was the brains? So
Oh,
literally
okay.
tell me what to do, and I would move the mouse
Yeah.
buttons. And that, so I got to see this whole process. And
So
what
you
happened,
learned film editing just
this
by
was
being the
earlier.
monkey.
Well, what I really learned was writing structuring. But
Yeah.
what I got to see was he had all this film, which
Yep.
as a reporter would call string, like just all your stuff.
Right.
And you cut it into chunks. The stuff between the chunks hits the cutting room floor. In the chunks is what you're going to use. And then the whole game was, how do you order the chunks so one out point, which is like a fade out, or a commercial, whatever, brings the viewer to that next end point. And that was sort of a revelation for me, where because I don't have perfect answers in my books, I wanted to feel like this escalating engagement with a question. And I use section breaks and then chapter breaks as those in and out points. And just how does one get to the next? And that sort of experience laid my whole sort of structural strategy. And within that, though, I think fiction, which is how sort of I came over to this, has a lot more structural variety.
Yes,
and so
absolutely.
When I read nonfiction books, maybe just because I've done more nonfiction writing, I recognize the structures pretty quickly. Whereas when I get stuck, I go to read fiction and think about the structure, and it gives me more ideas of how you can do something. And fiction does tend to be a lot more like, you're not trying to give it away in the first sentence. You're trying to bring someone along.
Right.
And so I'm constantly having like new ideas about how structure can work from reading fiction. So I try to read it very, actively, I would say.
How much do you think that comes from the structure or the process of publishing and book proposals?
How much of which aspect?
The homogeny of the way
Oh.
nonfiction is structured. How much do you think that has to do with book proposals?
That's a good question. I think
Because I think it has a lot to do with it.
I think probably a lot. I mean, my first book ended up not looking anything like the proposal, but
Good.
I think if you probably went through this process where you bring a book proposal to publishers, and they really want to know what book that's out there it's going to be just like, sort of. So that's obviously, pressure to look like, and in a lot of proposals, people will say it's going to be like this, but slightly different, right? And so I think there's a lot of pressure, just like doing like movie sequels, to make it like something that the industry has already kind of validated.
It's Jaws in space.
Yeah, exactly. And and I think I understand it. I also think it can be unfortunate because people have new ideas and there are new things to try. But so I think I want to hear your thoughts on that proposal specifically.
Well, I want to ask you about what fiction you've read this year that you've liked.
I started in
favorites, whatever you want to say.
My favorite fiction that I've read this year. Well, the book I most recently finished was called What Strange Paradise by Omar El Akkad, and I read his first book was called American War, and it was about a second American Civil War, but it was done really interestingly structurally, where it had like, he wrote historical documents on like minutes of congressional meetings. He didn't put them in so much that they slowed down the narrative, but when they came in, they were like surgically illuminating some sort of larger idea. And I thought he structured the book so masterfully, because there's an intro that I sort of even forgot about until because the story was just suspenseful enough that at the end you realize that he was setting up all these things that then brings together a much larger and sort of more ominous and harrowing picture, not to like give it away, but his structure, he was operating on multiple levels at once. Yeah. And I think that you realize there's sort of a mastery of craft there that comes into the picture sort of at the end. And so I was very eager to read his most recent book, What Strange Paradise, which this one he structured in a different way, where it's alternating chapters of before and after a particular seminal event in a character's life.
Oh, cool.
So he's playing with structure, which I really like. Two of my favorite writers, I would say, Martin McDonagh, the Irish playwright, and Haruki Murakami, the Japanese novelist. They have written some of the best things I've ever read, and I would say some of the worst things I've ever read also.
Yes.
And one thing I appreciate, like sometimes I'm just like...
strikeouts and hits, right?
And I mean, Martin McDonagh, like, we wrote this play called The Pillow Man, that, seeing that in the theater was like maybe the greatest experience of consuming any art I've ever had. And his most recent play I thought was like one of the worst things I've ever read. And but what I appreciate about both of them is that they are trying stuff, right? Like they don't have to try stuff. They're super successful by every metric, but they are still out there trying new things. You know, even I know people say about Murakami, he has a lot of recurring tropes, which is totally true, but he's still sort of putting it out there. And so in some ways, I find their failed experiments more thought-provoking than a lot of people's successes. And have you read 2666 by Roberto Bolaño? It's like,
no, I haven't.
Very difficult to read, but brilliant. Yeah. I'm still not sure what a lot of it had to do with anything, but the last section was, but it made me think new thoughts, even though I have no idea what a lot of it was about.
Yeah.
And there's a part in it where he writes a sentence where he's clearly talking at the reader, where this character starts lamenting the fact that even like, in this case, a bookish pharmacist would rather have like the perfect short story by a master who can craft a tidy short story than to really go and engage with the longer works where the writer is like doing bloody battle in the trenches. And that's clearly Bolaño saying like, I know this book is tough. I know this book's not perfect, but engage with this battle as opposed to your little perfect short story exercise.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So I find some of those battles more thought-provoking, even when I think they, in some respects fail.
I mean, this is true of books that I don't even agree with the, I might not even agree with the authors in nonfiction. I've read books this year that I don't even think I, agree with the basic premise, but the way the author is looking at the material and taking you through it is such a great ride that I almost don't care. Because what I'm getting, it's centrifugal. It's spinning me out to stuff I didn't know about, and So I think there's a great Errol Morris line where he's like, "There are no great books, there are no great movies, there are no great songs." He's like, "There's just good scenes," and like, I don't want to believe that it's true. But I like what you're saying about how sometimes the failed experiments can be more illuminating or just make you think more about whatever it is they were trying to talk about, which I think is it should be like a great hope for us, right? That we can feel free to experiment and go after things.
I totally agree with what you're saying about, I mean, when I think about back about the nonfiction that was the most generative for me, that got me like all riled up about thinking and exploring, it was often stuff that I disagreed with, but that was presented from an angle I hadn't. I mean, most notably some of Gladwell's work that I like critique in my own books, where it was stuff that was presented in a way that really got my wheels turning, even though what I ended up doing was, very much disagreeing with it, but really value, having read those things.
Yeah. It's just so hopeful, It's like I like that. Maybe that's a good place to stop. Although I don't want to stop. I want to keep asking you questions.
You've been throwing out, by the way, I just want to say you've been throwing out like one bestseller title after another here. Parent like a librarian. Think of your kids as a verb, or think of yourself as a verb.
God.
Like you're just
Look, man, you and I, we're in the same page about books. It's like I know it's very hard. I mean, like I'm glad. So I wanted to talk to you for a minute about your newsletter, the Range Report, which I just really love reading, and I want to make sure that everybody's watching this.
It's called Range Widely now.
Range Widely. I'm sorry.
How dare you?
Range Widely. There's been a slight rebranding. So yeah, David's newsletter, which you can find if you just go to your website or type in David Epstein newsletter, whatever, you'll find it. But are you finding, how's the newsletter? Tell us about how. I know you're not working on a book right now, right?
Correct.
Because I'm not. Okay. So how's the newsletter working for you? Are you discovering anything about the form? How's that working for you as a writer?
I would say I'm enjoying it. Like when a book is done, there's probably a period I go through where I'm not really enjoying writing very much. Like maybe because I've had my brain hooked up to those jumper cables already for a while, or because a lot of the writing I'm doing is like adaptations of stuff that I've already written. So it's not, not particularly creative. The newsletter I've really been enjoying. I sort of started as a personal sandbox and kind of during the pandemic to critique some reporting on science in the news, and started to realize that I could use it to think out loud, not just to say like any stupid thing, but to say, here's something that interests me. Here's something I learned about it. And I don't have to feel as fully formed as I do with a book. And I like that. Like I noticed that sometimes there's certain people I write emails to who I really value their tolerance for my digressive emails because I think with my fingers. Maybe that's one reason why I ended up as a writer. Like I often don't know what I think about something or what my knowledge gaps are until I try to write about something. And so I would do that sort of as an email to friends. It didn't surprise me, by the way, that one of the other newsletters I read, Maria Popova's, I think, which was just renamed, was Brain Pickings. That when I read how she started it, it was an email about what she was reading and thinking and the connections between those things that she would send to friends. And so I sort of feel like mine came out of that too, where it's like thinking out loud about something that interested me that I hope will be new to people that are reading it that week, whether it's something about performance improvement or experimentation, or like a one-off, like I wrote one about mass social media induced illness, which is this new, medical coinage in research literature for naming a phenomenon for people who were going on TikTok and getting Tourette's-like symptoms, basically. So I'm just sort of following my curiosity, and I've loved that kind of sandbox aspect to it, where I can write in a tone that doesn't have to try to sound authoritative,
Right.
And I can throw in a digression, and I can throw in just like a random thought. Like sometimes I've even stuck a section at the bottom called digressions, where I'm like, here are other things that I think this connects to.
Yeah.
So I've really been enjoying it that way. It's been kind of my personal explore. And my one concern is because previously, up until like 2 months ago, I wasn't publishing it regularly. So now that I'm publishing it regularly, it's like growing a little bit more. And I'm worried that I will, like with the mass social media induced illness one, I reached out to a researcher in Germany, which was a good thing to do. But I don't want it to become me like writing feature articles. I want it to continue to be this sandbox. And I'm worried that I will go more in that kind of feature article direction if I don't watch myself. So I want to make sure.
Keep you scrappy.
Recently on like defamiliarization, just like looking where I actually linked yours on borrowing a child to get a new perspective. And that was one where I was just like, here's a thing that's just interesting. I want to do it because it's weird. I want to make sure I keep doing some weird ones so that I don't kind of try to make it overly formal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like you don't want to calcify and you don't want to like get too pro with it. You want to stay the amateur, right? Which is another great theme of Range. Well, I think like, I've noticed like there's something about last week. It was funny. Like last week, I was like, all right, because I started doing a paid Tuesday version of my newsletter where like paying subscribers get this like extra special email from me. And so then I was like, okay, now that I have these special emails, like I gotta have like an editorial calendar. So I was like, okay, December. I like tried to type out all these things. And then this morning, somebody said something about the Beatles online that I disagreed with. And then I thought about something my wife said. And then I just wrote that, because I was like, no, that's good. And so I like the kind of like, I like to sort of have an idea of a plan, but then just the freedom to just be like, no, we're doing this today.
Yeah.
There's a great story about I think it was Rolling Stone. When they started Rolling Stone, they didn't really think it was going to be anything. And then people started paying attention to it. And I think they had an editorial meeting and they were like, why don't we pretend like no one's watching? They were like, why don't we keep proceeding as if no one's... And I always loved that. Like, what would we do if no one was watching? That's always kind of a fun, because when that's the problem with like immediate media, right? The idea that you can make something and put it out there and then see how people respond right away. That question of like, what would you do if no one was watching? How would you, and that tension between having an audience but also exploring. I guess it's an explore tension, in a sense. But
I mean, I'm hoping over time it can gravitate even more toward like something I think is interesting, putting it out there and having feel sort of. I'm going to make sure. I'm going to start by just making sure I have a post here and there that is just some weird thing that interested me that doesn't have to have a solid conclusion, and hopefully people will find that it'll at least like break them for a few minutes a week out of whatever kind of their normal what's directly in front of them, I guess.
I think that's what people are looking for, They want to be, I think that's the big, like, that's sort of the great thing about newsletters is it like comes right to your inbox and it's like, show me something new, take me someplace I haven't thought, it's the line between entertainment and education is very thin, I always think useful and interesting. I've had so much fun, David. Like, this has been so cool. Thank you for making the time for this. I think
Thanks.
I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up, though, because we are hitting the 1 hour mark and I don't want people to glaze over. Is there anything you'd like people to know before we sign off, other than to get your amazing book?
No, I mean, one thing I think, two quick things. One, I keep something I call a book of small experiments, where I force myself to, like, if I'm getting too much in my rut of competence, at least every other month to just try something new. That can be as simple as like interviewing someone in a job that I'm interested in that I don't know anything about, or as involved as taking an online class. And frankly, it was taking an online beginner's fiction writing class that I think really sort of was a bit of a revelation for writing range. During both my books, I've had to learn skills I didn't have at the beginning of the book in order to finish the project.
Oh, how interesting. So what was the skill? So fiction writing for range. What for the sports gene? What was it?
For range, I mean, for the sports gene, I had to go through. So in the writing of this, I have a master's degree in geological sciences. And in the reporting of the sports gene, I learned how to scrutinize research methods of scientific papers in a way such that I learned that my own master's thesis had some statistical malpractice in it that I didn't recognize.
Interesting.
Nor did the people giving me the master's degree when I did it. Right. And so I had to contradict some things I'd previously written, and I really had to learn how to scrutinize in a way. So I had to trash everything from the first year of research because I just didn't understand like what I was looking at.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a big one.
And okay. So you keep dumping this interesting stuff on me. I can't wrap. So you have a book of, tell me about the book again. I think you should write about this, by the way. I think this should be a range widely.
It's yeah, I will sometime. This is the current one I have. It's kind of, maybe that's a little embarrassing, but it's like Alice peeking.
Oh, it's Alice peeking through. Yeah.
Where like when I was a grad student, I had a book and you put a hypothesis and find some way to test it. So at least every other month I forced myself to come up with a question.
Yeah.
And find some way to test it. And that can be something simple, it can be something involved, but it's just kind of a reminder for me to like actually come up with a way to like explore this interest or thing that I want to try or whatever it is.
So tell me what you call the book again, though.
I just call my book of small experiments. I mean,
your book of small experiments, but they're really questions. They're really questions you have, and then you figure out what the experiment is that you can investigate the question.
And it doesn't always lead where I think. So the fiction writing example, I was at ProPublica when I started writing Range. And ProPublica, for people who don't know, it's a nonprofit that does investigative work, and it's like very traditional investigative journalism. And in that, the writing I was doing was very quote heavy, one, because like your lawyers want you to, when it's investigative work, like, can you put things in other words, and also using quotes for credibility and all this kind of stuff. And I realized in the writing of Range, well, I didn't realize yet, I was being very quote heavy, partly where if I didn't understand something well enough, I would just use a quote to paper over it, I think. But also I was used to that kind of writing. Right. I took this fiction writing class, partly just because I love fiction, but also hoping to get some new structural ideas. And I didn't really get new structural ideas, I wouldn't say, from that fiction class. But what I did get was there were these exercises where, one, you had to write a short story with only dialogue, and then write one with no dialogue whatsoever. And when I did that one, I realized like I've been way overusing dialogue in my book manuscript, and it gets tiring at the length of a book to read lots of quote. Like you can write more clearly with narration if you understand. Right. So I realized I needed to understand certain stuff better. I needed to strip, not quote something that I could just say just as easily in narration. I went back and revised every page of the manuscript. It was a little bit scary in the sense that I was like so in autopilot sort of, because I was competent with a certain thing, that until I got into a place where this fiction writing class where I felt suddenly my competence felt very stripped, that it sort of cued something that I think made the project a lot better. So that in that case, I didn't get what I was kind of looking for from the experiment, but I got something else that was really valuable.
That's awesome, man. Oh, I did want to say, if you haven't read John McPhee's piece on structure, that's fantastic. In draft number 4, I think is the name of that. Have you
I
read
have
that?
read some of his stuff
Yeah.
because again, I studied geological sciences, and he's like the most famous ever popular writer
Yes.
in geology, and so.
Can I? There's a great. I'm going to send you another book that I can't think of the title with right now. That was inspired by some of John cartoonist named Kevin Huizenga did a book, and I forget the name of it now. But it has a lot of stuff that's inspired from that McPhee book about geologic time. This has been awesome, man. I could keep going, but I'm not going to. I'm gonna cut myself off. I'm gonna leave myself wanting more. Thank you. And everyone, please check out Range. Check out David's newsletter, Range Widely. Thank you all for listening, and thank you, David.
It's totally my pleasure. I'm, like I said, been a fan. I think before you had any idea who I was. So yeah, it's a pleasure.
Well, the pleasure is mine. So thanks very much.